Okay, so each speaker will share about 20 minutes or less of their time, and then we will, at the very end of the event, have time for questions, okay? We have a powerful panel, too, that's coming up to it closer to the end. So again, we'll just thank you all and for being here, and let's just get started. I'd like to start with our first speaker. You got his masterpiece up there, Dr. Zach Walsh. I'm very proud to introduce my friend and co-researcher lead, Dr. Zach Walsh. He is a clinical psychologist. He's actively working as a clinical psychologist, plus a full professor at UBC who spent many years studying how treatments like medical cannabis can help people heal. And he's not afraid to challenge stigma. In fact, he's kind of like our bodyguard. He's out there for us, pushing new ideas and new ways to support people in recovery. Zach is a lead in Canada. He led the first clinical study trial on cannabis for PTSD, and he's spoken all across the country, even at the Canadian Senate, the House of Commons. His research has been featured in places like New York Times and the Time magazine, but most of all, he stands up for the people behind the research and for those who are often unheard. So I'd just like to please have you welcome someone I'm very grateful to be here, who's my teammate and friend, Dr. Zach Walsh.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much. That was like the nicest intro I've ever had. All right, I can see him right there. Good. Hi. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here and to be talking about this work that's really been, my life's work, a big part of it, and it is so encouraging to be able to come back to TRU. I've been at these at some of the Florian's events before, Dr. Fair's events, and it's always just such a beautiful spirit. And I think what's going on in the Maverick is, one of my absolute favorite projects. So anything I can do to come and talk about this stuff, and thank you for being willing to listen. The brief disclosure: I don't have to make the disclosure because more than 5 years ago, no one's been giving me any money recently. But still, I think it's worth saying, I have received money from Tilray and Doja, licensed producers of cannabis. I don't know if they still are, but that was a while ago to do research. I didn't get any personal money from them, but they helped fund the research, and I'm grateful to them for that. It doesn't really impact our discussion here at all, and some of this research has also been funded by some federal agencies, Canadian Institutes of Health Research and SSHRC and others. So I just want to recognize that. And what I want, there's such a great program today and a bunch of different talks about different aspects of what's going on in medical cannabis and harm reduction. So I want to give a little bit of a history and maybe touch on a few areas that I think are not going to be as much the main focus. So I think we're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about the terrible drug poisoning crisis that's going on, and particularly the opioids and the potential of cannabis to play a role in recovery, and I just want to maybe touch on some of the things that are maybe adjacent to that. Talking with history. This is the pictographic representation of cannabis. It's supposed to be like the cannabis stalks hanging, and this has been, historically it goes back further than we know, but we'll say at least 3000 BC. So we're talking about 5,000 years of history that cannabis has been. Really, I like to think of it as an ally to humanity, and this stigma that we're talking about is very real still, but we're finally getting out of it. But it's a tiny blip in a 5,000-year history where this has been really a part of the human experience and one of humanity's great allies. And I'm talking about this as medical cannabis, but the way I like to think about it, I think about it almost as like some other species that have been allied with humans, like maybe dogs. You could say, dogs are a nuisance. Dogs smell funny. Sometimes dogs will maybe, hurt a kid if they're not protected and all that. And someone might come along and say, we've got to ban dogs because of this ABC nuisance reason. And then if you were to reintroduce dogs, someone would say, but I'm visually impaired. I need a seeing eye dog. And you say, okay, well, you can have a medical dog. And then someone else might say, that's a good reason to have a dog. That person definitely needs it. But also, I'm feeling a little depressed, and it's nice to have a pet that cheers me up. So then we'd say, okay, you could have a maybe you could have a dog to help with mental distress as well. And then in time, you might say, well, maybe there's a bunch of reasons why people might want to have dogs, and maybe you can just let them have them and recognize that it can be a bit of a nuisance, but in general, it's something that's really helpful to humanity. It's another species that supports people, and that's just the way I want to invite us to think about cannabis now, is how do we see this as a potential ally, not without nuisance, maybe there's nuisance, some funky smell for sure, but really something that is overall an ally and has been for millennia. And, when we go back to some of the early mentions of it, go back almost to, like I said, 3000 BC, even into, and it was always considered to be part of the medical knowledge, right? It was seen as a plant medicine. And we start in China, but then we can jump, almost 4,500 years, and we have Queen Victoria. And, cannabis was used as a medicine widely in Victorian times. Even in the court of Queen Victoria, it was known to be a prominent medicine. There's some debate over how much Queen Victoria actually used. I'm not going to wade into that debate right now, but I do think that it is cool that, as much as British Columbia is maybe not the best name for this place, our capital city is named after a strong female cannabis user. So now taking us right up to the current time, and I'm going to drop us right in the middle of the Dark Ages, the War on Drugs, 1988. Picture me in high school, beautiful, flowing hair. And we were right in the middle of the War on Drugs then. And even then, at that time, when cannabis activists took the DEA, so the Drug Enforcement Agency of the U.S., in the middle of the drug war, the cannabis activists took them to court to say this should be recognized as a medicine, not as exclusively as a drug of abuse. And even then, at the height of the drug war, the US DEA said cannabis is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. Doesn't mean it has no harms, it's one of the safest therapeutically active substances. So you don't have to take it from me, take it from the DEA. Because you might think, oh, this guy's a cannabis advocate. No, this is coming from the other side of things. So that's a little bit of the history that I want to take us to, right? And so around that time, we started to see more and more people rediscovering and re-advocating for cannabis as a medicine. And so there's just a couple, I think they're common sense premises that I hope can guide us a little bit today and also guide the rest of my presentation. The first is that substituting a less harmful substance in place of a more harmful substance is harm reduction. First of all, we can, just in the name harm reduction, like reducing harms, how can you be against that? And I think when you take something that is less harmful, like cannabis, and replace it for something that's potentially more harmful, that's a win. It's not like we're just piling cannabis on top of other medicines. In many cases, it can reduce the use of other medicines. So we can control symptoms. What are the options? The options are you leave symptoms untreated and people suffer, or you treat them with something, and if you're going to treat them with something, you want something that has the least negative effects. So substituting cannabis for many of our medications, I think, can be a win. And even if it's on the edge, I think the second point, options and choice, are keys to patient-centered care. So I'm not saying that you have to use cannabis for a variety of disorders that we might talk about today, but shouldn't you be allowed to have that choice? If the effectiveness is on par and if the harms are very reasonable and in some cases less. So that leads us to some of our research that I want to talk about today. These are a couple of papers that we did a little bit over 10 years ago. And at the time, they were the largest studies. I think they might still be the largest studies of medical cannabis users in Canada. And what they found, probably not surprising to many people in this room, is that people use cannabis for a number of symptoms. And there's three that really stick out that I want to talk about today that I think are really relevant. Sleep, pain, and anxiety. And these are things that trouble so many of us, right? These aren't obscure symptoms. These are major symptoms that characterize so much ill health. And, when you think about what are the options, you could leave your sleep untreated, you could leave the anxiety untreated, but if you're going to treat them, what is the frontline treatment in a place where cannabis is not available? Usually it's benzodiazepines and things like Valium or Ativan, lorazepam, a bunch of different names for them. But if you're going to take those, you got to think, what is the pros and cons of that versus cannabis? And what's the role of stigma? Because when you look at the research, and I think there's a good role, I'm not saying we need to criminalize benzodiazepines, certainly not. But if you think about benzos, there's all kinds of evidence suggesting that they can lead to dementia, right? There's much stronger evidence around the harms of benzos and much stronger evidence around addiction to benzos than there is to cannabis. Yet these are some of the most widely prescribed medications out there because things like sleep and anxiety trouble a lot of people. So even if we just have another option for sleep and anxiety and also pain, I think that's huge. That's a huge win. And we need to think about cannabis as a potential substitute for benzodiazepines. And I'll talk about that for a moment. But I also want to talk about the most widely used substance, maybe next to caffeine, which cannabis is not a great substitute for, let's be serious. But alcohol, right? And I want to also pay tribute to one of the real forefathers of this renaissance of cannabis substitution research, Todd McCurria. So we're going now to 2004, and this is the first scientific paper suggesting that cannabis could be a substitute and as harm reduction. So I always want to give credit to Dr. Todd. And then I want to move on to what our own findings are. So we started asking people, are you using cannabis? We saw that people are using cannabis for things like pain and sleep and anxiety. And we thought, you know what, we should ask people if they're using cannabis instead of these drugs. And lo and behold, that's what we found. So when we looked at this survey of medical cannabis users, you see regardless of what their main use of cannabis was for, some have it for pain, others are for mood and anxiety. A lot of people with side effects of HIV/AIDS medications, gastrointestinal stuff. But across the board, people are using cannabis to substitute for alcohol, illicit drugs, and prescription drugs. So it's not being used on top of, it's being used instead of. And in many cases, that can be harm reduction. We asked another broader sample, and we found the same thing. And this is all about 10 years ago when this was becoming, more new. And you see, over a third or around a third of respondents are saying, yeah, they're using cannabis as a substitute. And in many cases, they're using it for more than one reason. So they're using it as a substitute. If you look at the folks with mental health conditions and with pain, they're using it for benzodiazepines and for opioids. So because of the pain relieving features, it can be a substitute for a couple drugs. And particularly in our current crisis, the mixture of benzodiazepines and opioids is so deadly. So if we can get something that can substitute for both of those with a modest side effect profile, that's a big win. And we started to see it as something that can reduce costs too. In the US, when they started having medical cannabis regulations, they saw that people were, prescriptions of those drugs fell. So it's not just that people are saying they're doing it, they're actually seeing reductions in sales. And more recently, we've started to see research focused on benzodiazepine substitution, and you can see that for people with chronic pain, anxiety, sleep disorders, 72% decreased use of benzodiazepines. And in a different study, a slightly smaller one, but still over 100 people, almost half reduced their use of benzodiazepines. So benzodiazepines, one of the most widely prescribed drugs, have a lot of problems associated with them, and this is a great potential substitute. I also work with a lot of young adults. I'm at UBC. It's a very safe and lovely campus, but when we do have problems, behavior problems or fights or anything that happens there, it's almost always related to alcohol. We have a bar on campus, which is, I guess customary, but also surprising. Why are we selling alcohol on campus? And if we are going to sell alcohol on campus, why aren't we selling cannabis? Why are people who want to go and socialize and catch a buzz, which is not unusual for young adults or old adults or adults, why are they forced into alcohol and not given a cannabis option? And what we see is that, young people, you gotta always trust the youth. The youth are much smarter than us. And they're already starting to substitute alcohol for cannabis. We're seeing an increase in cannabis use and a decrease in alcohol use. And according to the Georgia Straight, it's hurting the bar scene, live music venues, but maybe we'll see a place where these venues can start to sell cannabis, because right now they can't. They can only sell alcohol. So we've got to start looking at these societal prejudices that steer people towards alcohol, and I don't need to go on about the risks of alcohol. They're substantial, far worse than the risks of cannabis. And, we need to get the health authorities to to rethink some of their advice here. This is not so old. This is from 2019, where it says, do not combine cannabis with other high-risk behaviors, such as consuming alcohol or other drugs. Yet, what we see in our surveys of students is that only when they use cannabis and alcohol together, I don't want to scandalize anyone, but some young people will use both cannabis and alcohol. And when they do, only 4% reported that cannabis made them drink more, whereas 56% reported that they drink less. And drinking less is a big piece of harm reduction. You know, most of the bad things that happen from alcohol to young adults, not the long-term effects on organ damage, but the accidents, the regrettable behaviors, all of that stuff, usually tends to happen after about 5 or 6 drinks. So if we can reduce the speed and density of people's alcohol consumption, that's a big harm reduction win. And it seems to be that's the way cannabis works. And even 1 in 10 of them, and this is a few years ago, it might be higher now, are using cannabis purposely to reduce their use of alcohol. In a follow-up study by one of my students, Joey Rootman, we looked at using people's smartphones to check in with them when they were when they were going out and having a few drinks, or on the weekend, or partying, or whatever, however you want to describe it. What were they doing? And we found out that for these folks, cannabis use actually led to fewer drinks consumed. So if people were using cannabis before or during their alcohol use, they drank 17% fewer drinks. Difference between 5 and 4 drinks or 10 and 8 drinks. And that may not seem like a lot, but what we see is after 5 or 6 drinks, the harms go right up. So each drink after that is a big risk, and cannabis perhaps reduces those risks. And we've had subsequent research to show that some of the harmful behaviors are reduced when people are using cannabis. So also rethinking this idea, if you're going to drink as much as you would anyways and just pile cannabis on top of it, yeah, that's probably not the best. But if cannabis makes you consume less alcohol, it could also be a form of harm reduction. And you might say, oh, great, well, you're going to have young people, based on cannabis stigma, that are incapacitated because they're using cannabis all the time. But what this study, this is coming from JAMA Psychiatry, one of the most conservative and reputable scientific journals out there, and what they showed on this huge review is that that there's very modest acute effects after the cannabis wears off, and that after 72 hours, people seem entirely back to baseline, even if they're very heavy cannabis users. So it seems like there's not the kind of long-term impairment that we had so long feared. So I think this is, taken together, it's an argument for harm reduction. And I also just want to touch on one other thing, which, so many people, and as Dr. Fair said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I run the problematic substance use clinic. So I've spent my life treating people who struggle with substance use problems. So it's not like it's something that I'm glib about or take lightly. And I know that so many people who really struggle also have post-traumatic stress disorder. If people are really struggling with substance use, there's also some other stuff often going on. And cannabis has been demonstrated to really be helpful for some folks with PTSD. What we see in this first study from just a few years ago, that if people were using cannabis when they went into treatment for PTSD, it didn't matter one way or the other. But when people were combining it with CBT, it seemed to help reduce PTSD symptoms. In another study that perhaps Dr. Malloy might touch on in a moment, so I won't get into too much detail, but we found that people who were using cannabis and had PTSD had lower rates of suicidal ideation and suicidality and depression. So even if it doesn't cure the PTSD, sometimes it can make life more tolerable and reduce depression and suicide in people who struggle with PTSD. Finally, just to close, cannabis is not necessarily a cure for PTSD, but it can reduce the symptoms. And this is, I think, the best and most comprehensive study of cannabis and PTSD. And what we found was that most of the time when people used cannabis, it reduced acute symptoms. The PTSD didn't go away, but right after using cannabis, the symptoms of intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, irritability, and anxiety would be reduced. And we know from working in treatment that getting some of those symptoms under control can be such an important step in a more fulsome recovery. So I think cannabis has tremendous potential for harm reduction across the spectrum of people who struggle with substance use. And you'll hear more about the opioid crisis coming up, but I just also wanted to touch a little bit on benzodiazepines and alcohol and on young adults and some other areas where cannabis can be an effective mode of harm reduction. And I just want to thank you all so much for your attention. Never hesitate to reach out to me. I'm easy to find. If you just Google Zach Walsh Cannabis, you'll find me if you don't take this number down. But if you do, I'm always happy to hear an email from anyone. And thanks to all my tremendous students, some of whom are here today, who have helped me with this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh.